The world was fragile when the Silurian period began. The oceans were still recovering from a disaster so massive that it erased most of the life that had once filled them. Entire ecosystems had collapsed. Entire evolutionary experiments had ended. For a long time, the planet felt empty, quieter than it had been in millions of years. But slowly, almost cautiously, the Earth began to rebuild itself. The ice sheets that had covered Gondwana were shrinking, retreating across the continent as global temperatures warmed again. As the ice melted, sea levels rose, flooding the edges of continents and creating new shallow seas. These warm, sunlit waters became the birthplace of a new world. Where the Ordovician seas had ended in silence, the Silurian seas began with faint threads of green drifting just beneath the surface. Plankton were the first to return. They bloomed in the warming waters, and their presence changed everything. Where plankton grows, life follows. Slowly, tiny creatures began to take advantage of the food they provided. Small filter feeders reappeared on the seafloor, and soon the oceans were no longer barren. There were still vast empty stretches, but life had begun to creep back into place. Crinoids rose first, spreading across continental shelves and shallow platforms. Their long, feathery arms opened like underwater flowers, catching drifting particles. With them came the brachiopods, anchoring themselves to the seafloor, opening and closing their shells in slow rhythm. Corals, too, emerged from the devastation. They grew in small patches at first, clinging to fragments of limestone, building tiny colonies that slowly expanded into something far larger. These small clusters would eventually become enormous reef systems that stretched across the tropics. But this new world was not simply a copy of the one that had been lost. The survivors of the extinction were not the same as their ancestors. They were tougher, adapted to stress, able to survive in unstable environments. Their resilience shaped the direction the Silurian world would follow. The ecosystems that emerged did not simply recreate the past. They evolved into something new. Fish, which had spent most of the Ordovician hiding along the seafloor, now found themselves in an ocean with far fewer predators. They began to explore new habitats, moving into open waters for the first time. These early vertebrates were still small and jawless, covered in bony plates for protection, but their newfound freedom allowed them to diversify in ways they never could before. Some became faster swimmers. Some developed new fin shapes. Some found ways to lift themselves above the sediment and glide through the water column. The transformation was slow but meaningful. With each generation, fish became less tied to the bottom. With each small improvement, they expanded their reach. This shift, subtle and gradual, would eventually lead to one of the most important evolutionary inventions in Earth's history, the jaw. But in the early Silurian, that innovation had not yet arrived. The oceans were only beginning to set the stage for it. While the oceans were healing, something equally remarkable was happening on land. For billions of years, the continents had been nothing more than lifeless rock. Wind, sun, and rain shaped the landscape, but no living thing had stepped onto it with purpose. That began to change. Tiny plants, little more than green threads clinging to moisture, started to grow along the damp edges of lakes and coastlines. They had no roots, no true stems, and no leaves, but they were enough to alter the face of the earth. Where they grew, they trapped sediments, stabilized the ground, and created small pockets of moisture. In these pockets, other organisms followed. Primitive arthropods, small and cautious, crept onto land to feed on decaying plant matter or to escape aquatic predators. These were the earliest pioneers, the first creatures to take steps into a new world. The land was still harsh and deadly, but life had crossed the boundary. The conquest of land had begun, even if it was only in its earliest and most fragile form. Back in the oceans, the reefs of the Silurian expanded at a scale never before seen. Coral and stromatoporoid reefs grew into massive structures that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. They formed underwater walls, plateaus, and terraces that acted like entire cities full of life. Between their structures moved trilobites, small fish, sponges, mollusks, and a vast array of organisms that depended on the safety and complexity these reefs offered. These reefs were not quiet places. They were crowded, competitive, filled with movement and color. Yet beyond them, the mid-water space of the open ocean was still waiting for new rulers. The predators of the Ordovician had not returned in the same numbers or strength. The world had opened a door for new hunters to rise, but evolution had not yet stepped through it. The Silurian, in many ways, felt like a world gathering strength, a world preparing for something. The oceans were warmer, the reefs were growing, fish were evolving rapidly, and life was beginning to test the land for the first time. Everything was shifting, building, aligning. The planet had survived catastrophe, and now it was moving toward its next great chapter. What was coming would reshape the oceans forever. What was coming would create the first true predators of the modern world. What was coming would mark the rise of the jaws, and the story continues. Life in those early oceans did not move quickly, and it certainly didn't evolve with purpose or direction. It drifted, unhurried, shaped only by chemistry, pressure, heat, and chance. But over millions of years, chance accumulates. And when chance interacts with replication, even primitive replication, patterns begin to change. Patterns begin to shift. And slowly, the earliest forms of life, the microbial pioneers, began to diversify. These were not organisms in the way we imagine life today. They had no organs, no specialized tissues, no bones, no shells. They had not yet discovered movement, senses, or coordination. What they did have was the most powerful ability in the history of the planet, the ability to copy themselves with slight variations. Most variations were meaningless, some were harmful, but a few, just a few, gave these microbes a subtle advantage, a slightly more stable membrane, a molecule that folded a bit more efficiently, a metabolic shortcut that saved a tiny fraction of energy. In a world where survival depended on the smallest efficiencies, even these microscopic improvements mattered. As time passed, these early microbes spread across the ocean, colonizing volcanic vents, seafloor sediments, and drifting nutrient-rich particles. Some thrived in blistering heat, others flourished in cooler, calmer waters, and as their numbers grew, so did the complexity of their interactions. Some began to compete for resources, others unknowingly cooperated, forming mats and layers where one microbe's waste became another's fuel. It was the first form of ecological structure on Earth, not forests or coral reefs, but dense microbial carpets stretching across ancient coastlines. These mats were vibrant, colorful, and dynamic, though no human eye would witness them for billions of years. Layer by layer, they added thin films of life above the sediment, tiny factories capturing sunlight, processing chemicals, and subtly altering the atmosphere. Every day, every hour, they exhaled small amounts of gas. And while that gas would not yet accumulate in the air, the process had begun. Life had found a way, not just to exist, but to leave a fingerprint on the planet. Deep in the oceans, something else was happening as well. Microbes near hydrothermal vents evolved structures and molecules that allowed them to harness energy directly from the Earth's interior. These organisms, thriving in near-boiling water, laid the foundation for what would become some of the most resilient life forms ever known. They existed independent of sunlight, using chemistry alone to fuel their existence. In a future far beyond anything these microbes could understand, their descendants would be found in deep mines, beneath glaciers, and even inside nuclear reactors. On the ocean surface, floaters and drifters began to explore new strategies. Some developed pigments that allowed them to use sunlight more efficiently. Others evolved more robust membranes that protected them from harmful radiation. Every microscopic experiment was a step toward greater complexity, even if those steps were imperceptible over short timescales. For millions of years, this was the world, a planet ruled entirely by microscopic life. But microbes did more than just survive. They transformed the environment around them. The chemistry of the oceans began to shift. Gases dissolved into the water, reacted with minerals, and cycled back out again. The oceans darkened, then lightened. Temperature fluctuated. Nutrients appeared in some regions and vanished from others. Each environmental shift triggered new evolutionary pressures. Some microbes adapted, others died out, leaving behind traces in sediments that would harden into ancient geological records. During this time, genetic material, primitive RNA, and later simple DNA-like structures began to accumulate errors as it copied. Usually, these errors were tiny and inconsequential, but occasionally, an error created an opportunity. A new protein, a more efficient enzyme, a molecule that allowed a cell to react to a specific chemical gradient. These changes were subtle, slow, and random, but over millions of years, they accumulated into the foundations of recognizable biological complexity. As the oceans circulated and currents shifted, microbes were carried into new environments. Some were swept into dark trenches, others were pushed toward coastlines or trapped inside shallow lagoons. Isolation created variation. Variation created new forms, and new forms created the earliest branches of the tree of life. Branches so ancient, so primitive, and so subtle that scientists today still struggle to classify them. But even at this early stage, a profound transformation was brewing on the planet. A transformation triggered entirely by the smallest organisms in existence. Certain microbes evolved a remarkable capability, the ability to capture sunlight and store its energy through a biochemical process that, in time, would reshape the entire world. It was a process that required pigments, catalysts, and proteins far more advanced than anything life had produced to that point. But slowly, very slowly, the innovation took hold. Photosynthesis had begun. At first, it was simple and inefficient. These microbes absorbed light and produced small amounts of energy, enough only to maintain themselves. But natural selection refined the process. Membranes reorganized, pigments diversified, chemical pathways streamlined. Over millions of years, photosynthesis became not just a survival strategy, but the defining ecological force of the planet. And as photosynthetic microbes spread, they released something new into the environment, a gas that at first accumulated only in small, localized patches, a gas that reacted with minerals in the ocean and was absorbed into rocks before it ever had a chance to escape into the air. But slowly, that process reached its limit. Slowly, the iron in the oceans was used up. Slowly, the capacity of the oceans to absorb this gas diminished. And then, it began to rise. Oxygen. For now, its presence was faint, nearly undetectable, but it was there, floating in the water, dissolving into the currents, escaping into tiny pockets of atmosphere. Life had made something new, and that something would, in time, shatter the world these microbes knew. But before that upheaval could occur, life continued its slow expansion across the oceans. Microbial colonies became thicker and more organized. Some species formed protective biofilms. Others developed ways to communicate chemically, producing signals that influenced the behavior of neighboring cells. These signals were primitive, nothing like the communication used by modern organisms, but they marked the first steps toward coordinated behavior. Storms raged above the ocean. Lightning cracked across the sky. Volcanic eruptions sent ash spiraling into the atmosphere. Yet through all this chaos, life persisted. Its structures were simple, but its resilience was unmatched. No matter how violent the planet became, some microbes always survived, clinging to rock, drifting in currents, sheltering in underwater crevices. The oceans grew richer with metabolic diversity. Some microbes broke down sulfur. Others consumed methane. A few developed the ability to use nitrates or iron compounds. Life became a global network of chemical reactions, reactions that slowly altered the planet's crust, atmosphere, and oceans. Earth was no longer just a geological object. It was a living world shaped by the activities of countless invisible organisms. And as microbial communities interacted, some encountered each other as competitors. Others became partners. In some cases, one microbe engulfed another, not as prey, but as a symbiotic partner. These internal partnerships would not yet blossom into the complexity of eukaryotic cells. That innovation was still far in the future, but the groundwork was being laid. Inside the seas of ancient Earth, life was not static. It was experimenting, refining, and adapting, and with each adaptation, the planet itself shifted closer to the next great transformation. Life was preparing, unknowingly, for the first global catastrophe it would ever cause. A catastrophe born not from meteor impacts or volcanic eruptions, but from biology itself. Oxygen would rise, oceans would rust, atmospheres would change, and most of the life that existed at this time would not survive the new world they were creating. But evolution doesn't pause, it simply continues, and the story of life was only just beginning. The rise of oxygen did not happen overnight. It wasn't a sudden dramatic shift, but a slow, creeping transformation. For millions of years, oxygen lingered in the oceans in tiny, almost imperceptible traces, constantly reacting with dissolved iron and minerals before it could accumulate. Yet with every passing millennium, the balance continued to tilt. Photosynthetic microbes produced oxygen faster than the oceans could absorb it. Rocks and minerals continued to rust until they reached saturation. And gradually, the chemistry of Earth crossed a threshold it could never return from. In some regions of the ocean, oxygen reached concentrations high enough to threaten the survival of anaerobic microbes, organisms that had evolved in a world completely devoid of this reactive gas. Oxygen, to them, was deadly. It damaged their proteins, destabilized their membranes, and interfered with their metabolic pathways. Entire ecosystems found themselves in danger, not from predators or competition, but from the byproduct of life itself. The oceans darkened in places where iron minerals settled out of the water, creating vast layers of rust that would one day become banded iron formations. These ancient geological structures still exist today, silent storytellers of a time when the planet's chemistry was being rewritten by the tiniest organisms imaginable. But even as oxygen spread, life adapted. Some microbes developed protective enzymes capable of neutralizing oxygen's harmful effects. Others evolved entirely new metabolic pathways that used oxygen as a source of energy. These oxygen-tolerant organisms found themselves at the dawn of a new evolutionary frontier. They were not yet the complex multicellular beings that would eventually dominate the planet, but they were the first pioneers of a new biochemical landscape. In shallow waters, microbial mats responded to the changing environment by becoming more layered and more complex. The top layers, basking in sunlight, produced oxygen, while the bottom layers remained sheltered and anaerobic. This separation allowed multiple forms of life to coexist, each occupying its own microenvironment within the same structure. These mats were bustling ecosystems, cooperating, competing, and influencing one another in ways that would lay the groundwork for the future complexity of life on Earth. The atmosphere, still faint and thin compared to what it would later become, began to accumulate oxygen slowly. At first, only slight traces lingered above the ocean surface, but over millions of years, even slight traces became noticeable. Atmospheric chemistry shifted, new reactions took place, new gases formed, including ozone, an invisible shield high in the sky that would eventually protect the planet from harmful ultraviolet radiation. With this protection, the surface of the ocean became safer for life. Sunlight no longer delivered its full destructive force to the upper layers of water. DNA molecules, once vulnerable to ultraviolet damage, found themselves less frequently disrupted. This shift, subtle as it seemed, created opportunities for new evolutionary paths. Life began inching closer to the surface, exploring brighter environments that had previously been too dangerous to inhabit. Deep in the oceans, the balance of power also shifted. Hydrothermal vent communities continued to thrive in their isolated pockets of heat and mineral-rich water. These ecosystems remained stable refuges for anaerobic organisms, even as oxygen slowly invaded the rest of the ocean. But isolation could not halt change forever. Genetic material exchanged between species through primitive forms of horizontal gene transfer. Even microbes separated by vast distances shared innovations indirectly, shaping one another's evolution through tiny packages of DNA and RNA. The microbial world became a place of rapid innovation, Though rapid still meant millions of years, cells experimented with new shapes, developing ridges, folds, and protrusions that increased their surface area and efficiency. Others grew more robust internal scaffolding that helped them maintain their form. Life didn't yet have skeletons or shells, but the earliest hints of structural complexity were beginning to emerge. As oxygen increased, the energy available to organisms skyrocketed. Oxygen-based metabolism produces far more energy than anaerobic pathways, and this surplus allowed microbes to grow larger, divide more quickly, and develop more intricate internal chemistry. With more energy, evolution can explore new possibilities that would one day lead to true cellular complexity. But for now, these were only the earliest sparks of what would eventually become the eukaryotic cell. The world was still dominated by simple life, and the oxygenation event was far from over. As more oxygen entered the atmosphere, it reacted with volcanic gases and changed the climate. Methane, once abundant, was oxidized into carbon dioxide, a less potent greenhouse gas. This dramatic shift triggered a global drop in temperature. The Earth began to cool. Ice crept from the poles toward the equator. Glaciers thickened. Snow covered vast regions of land. The oceans, once warm and teeming with microbial life, chilled. For a moment in geological time, it seemed that life's greatest innovation, oxygen, had pushed the planet toward catastrophe. The cooling strengthened, and some scientists today believe Earth may have come dangerously close to freezing entirely. Yet even in the cold, life endured. Microbes found refuge in thermal vents, under layers of ice, and near volcanic hotspots. The flexibility of life allowed it to survive conditions far harsher than anything it had experienced before. And the pressure of these new environments sparked further innovation, changes in membrane composition, new metabolic strategies, and new forms of molecular repair that helped cells cope with freezing temperatures. Eventually, volcanic activity and other geological processes restored balance. Carbon dioxide accumulated again. Temperatures rose. Glacial ice retreated, the oath stabilized, and through all of this upheaval, photosynthetic microbes continued their work, pumping oxygen into the atmosphere at a pace slow enough to be nearly invisible to the life around them, but dramatic enough to reshape the future of the planet forever. As oxygen rose higher, the environment became increasingly favorable for the development of more complex chemistry within cells. The building blocks of future complexity, cytoskeleton proteins, internal compartments, specialized enzymes, began to appear. These innovations emerged independently in different microbial lineages, creating a patchwork of pre-adaptations that would eventually converge. Life was preparing for the next major leap in evolution, even if it would take hundreds of millions of years for that leap to happen. In shallow waters, microbial colonies grew thick and layered, creating towers and domes that rose from the seafloor. These formations, built from carbonate minerals and microbial growth, were among the first physical structures ever constructed by life. They stood as monuments to the persistence of simple organisms, working collectively, filtering nutrients, capturing sunlight, and leaving behind mineral traces that would last billions of years. Elsewhere, tiny plankton-like organisms drifted through the ocean currents, undergoing subtle genetic changes that nudged them away from the strict simplicity of their ancestors. These early experiments would not immediately lead to multicellularity, but they represented the beginning of diversity, small steps away from uniformity, small steps toward the explosion of life that lay in the distant future. The world was quiet then, without plants, animals, or any form of complex life. The oceans were the only domain where biology existed. Yet within those oceans, an invisible drama unfolded, an evolutionary arms race between oxygen-producing microbes and those trying to survive the changing environment. Competition intensified, ecological niches formed, and the genetic foundation of every organism that would one day exist, every plant, every insect, every fish, every human, was being written, molecule by molecule. The seas were alive, not with movement or sound, but with constant chemical activity. Every cell, every replication, every mutation contributed to the gradual rise of biological complexity. The stage was set. The environment was shifting, And the next great transformation, one that would forever change the architecture of life, was slowly approaching. Evolution was preparing to cross a threshold far more dramatic than anything that had come before. And when it did, Earth would never look the same again. As the oceans settled into their new, slowly oxygenating state, life in the microbial world continued its patient transformation. There were no fish yet, no plants, no animals, but the groundwork for all of them was being laid in ways that were nearly impossible to see at the time. Evolution doesn't announce itself. It works quietly, hidden in the chemistry of cells, in tiny changes that accumulate over unimaginable stretches of time. Some microbes developed more intricate ways to store energy. Others formed internal membranes that helped separate different reactions inside the cell. These internal divisions, simple as they were, gave cells more control over their own processes. They could shield delicate molecules, optimize reactions, and become more efficient at using resources. These improvements may seem small, but they were steps toward the formation of compartments inside cells, structures that would one day allow life to grow far more complex. The oceans themselves played a crucial role in shaping these early innovations. Warm, shallow seas offered sunlight and nutrients, creating ideal conditions for photosynthetic organisms. Deeper waters provided darkness and stability for those that preferred cooler, low-oxygen environments. Hydrothermal vents remained refuges of chemical richness, pumping minerals and heat into the surrounding waters, allowing unique communities to flourish even as the broader ocean changed around them. In this vast, layered environment, evolution had a nearly infinite number of opportunities to experiment. Oceans stretched across the planet, and in every droplet, billions of microbes lived, died, replicated, mutated, and spread. The genetic lottery played out continuously, with each replication introducing small differences that could be passed on to future generations. Most changes did nothing. Some were harmful, but a few, just a tiny fraction, made certain cells more capable of surviving in an oxygenated world. These tiny advantages compounded with time. Organisms that could tolerate oxygen slowly outcompeted those that couldn't. New ecosystems emerged in areas where oxygen reached higher concentrations, while older anaerobic communities retreated into deeper or more isolated pockets of the ocean. The planet wasn't just changing its chemistry, it was reorganizing its biosphere. As oxygen levels increased, iron deposits dwindled. For millions of years, oxygen had been trapped in reactions with dissolved iron, forming rust that fell to the seafloor. But eventually, the supply of iron was depleted. The oceans could no longer consume all the oxygen being produced. At that point, oxygen began to accumulate permanently in the water, and later, in the atmosphere. It was a turning point for life, but also for geology and climate. With more oxygen in the air, weathering on land accelerated. Rocks broke down faster, releasing minerals into the oceans. Nutrient levels shifted, altering where life could thrive. Wind patterns changed. Storm systems behaved differently. The entire Earth system slowly adapted to this new balance, and at the heart of it all were countless microscopic organisms, unaware of the scale of the transformation they were causing. The rise of oxygen also altered the way sunlight interacted with the atmosphere. The formation of the ozone layer created new conditions at the ocean surface. Ultraviolet radiation, once intense and damaging, was filtered more effectively. This allowed life to survive closer to the surface, where sunlight was abundant. Photosynthesis increased, productivity grew, more food was available, more energy flowed through microbial ecosystems. Small changes cascaded into larger ones. In some regions, microbial communities grew so dense that they formed floating layers on the water's surface, turning vast stretches of ocean into colorful, shimmering fields of life. These fields weren't plants, and they weren't algae as we know them today, but they were early experiments in living close to light. They drifted with currents, multiplied quickly, and died just as fast, leaving organic material that sank to the seafloor and influenced the chemistry of the deep ocean. Meanwhile, deeper in the water column, other organisms began taking advantage of new opportunities created by the shifting environment. Some microbes evolved the ability to consume dead material sinking from above. These scavengers formed the earliest versions of what would eventually become complex food webs. It was still a world without mouths or limbs or movement in the animal sense, but biological relationships were becoming more sophisticated. The recycling of nutrients became more efficient. Organic matter that once accumulated slowly on the seafloor began to decompose more rapidly as microbes adapted to new food sources. These changes affected the entire ocean system. Carbon cycles shifted. Sedimentation patterns changed. The seafloor became dotted with new forms of microbial colonies, each responding to the oxygenated world in its own way. Even the structure of the ocean itself was altered. Temperature gradients shifted, generating new circulation patterns. Warm water traveled differently. Cold water sank in new regions. Nutrient-rich deep currents brought essential elements to places that had previously been barren. Life followed these currents, colonizing new environments and diversifying as it spread. This period of Earth's history was defined not by dramatic events or sudden leaps, but by continuous, subtle change. The transformation was relentless, shaping everything from global climate to cellular biology. And yet, from the perspective of the microbes living through it, nothing felt unusual. They continued feeding, dividing, and spreading as they always had, unaware that their collective actions were setting the stage for future complexity. The earliest hints of multicellular cooperation appeared during this time. Some microbes began forming colonies where cells stayed connected after division. These clusters did not yet form tissues or organs, but they represented a fundamental shift in the way life could organize itself. Within these clusters, different cells sometimes took on different roles, even if only in simple ways. Some produced oxygen, while others focused on absorbing nutrients or maintaining structural integrity. This division of labor increased the efficiency of the group as a whole. Colonies that could cooperate grew larger and more stable. They were better able to withstand environmental stress and more capable of exploiting new ecological niches. Cooperation, once a rare accident, became a powerful evolutionary strategy. Occasionally, colonies would break apart, sending fragments into new regions of the ocean where they could take root and grow. As these clusters spread, they encountered new conditions that forced them to adapt, diversify, and evolve. Each new variation introduced new possibilities, some of which would eventually lead to the first true multicellular organisms. But that milestone was still far in the future. For now, life remained simple in appearance, yet sophisticated in function. Microbes dominated every corner of the ocean, shaping the planet in ways far more profound than any large organism could. They controlled atmospheric chemistry. They influenced climate. They built geological structures. They experimented endlessly with new biochemical strategies. And through all these changes, one trend persisted: the slow, steady rise of oxygen. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sudden, but it was constant, and its impact was irreversible. The world these microbes inherited was no longer the world they had been born into. It was a world in transition, a world slowly preparing for the next great leap in complexity. In time, those early colonies would become more organized. Their cells would communicate more effectively. Their internal structures would grow more elaborate. The foundations of multicellularity were forming, not through sudden invention, but through billions of years of small, cumulative changes. Evolution was patient. It had no destination and no intention. It simply explored whatever possibilities the environment allowed. And now, with oxygen abundant and energy more readily available than ever before, the range of possibilities expanded dramatically. The ocean, once a realm of simple chemistry and single-celled organisms, was becoming a cradle of future diversity. Every mutation, every replication, every tiny shift in cellular machinery contributed to a slow march toward complexity. In time, the descendants of these ancient microbes would evolve into algae, plants, fungi, and animals. But for now, the story remained microscopic. The world was still quiet, still dominated by simple forms of life. Yet beneath the surface of this simplicity, the machinery of evolution was working tirelessly, pushing life toward a future that would soon transform the Earth into a very different planet. When oxygen reached a critical level, when enough innovations had accumulated, when cooperation had become stable, the next chapter of life's story would begin. As oxygen continued spreading through the oceans and slowly accumulating in the atmosphere, life found itself caught in a perpetual state of adjustment. Every new shift in chemistry created challenges, but also opportunities. And with every challenge, evolution responded in small, gradual steps. What seemed like slow, microscopic change would eventually define the path life would take for the next billion years. Many microbial communities began forming larger, more organized clusters. These were not yet true organisms in the modern sense, but they represented a departure from pure individuality. Cells remained attached after division, creating filaments, sheets, and spherical colonies. Some clusters floated near the surface, catching sunlight. Others clung to rocky surfaces, building layered structures that rose gently from the seafloor. Within these clusters, simple patterns began to form. Cells on the outside were exposed to more light and more oxygen, forcing them to evolve ways to cope with chemical stress. Cells on the inside found themselves shaded and protected, performing different tasks better suited to low-oxygen environments. This was an early, primitive form of specialization, an important first step toward the division of labor that would one day characterize complex life. The ocean itself continued shaping evolution in countless subtle ways. Currents carried colonies across vast distances, exposing them to different temperatures, nutrient levels, and chemical gradients. Drifting clusters that survived long journeys spread their genetic innovations across the planet, seeding new regions with lineages better adapted to oxygenated environments. Microbial mats on the seafloor continued thickening and expanding. They rose into bumpy, irregular shapes as layers of cells grew, died, and were replaced. These mats acted as miniature worlds, each layer hosting a slightly different ecosystem. Sunlit top layers produced oxygen and sugars. Deeper layers, starved of light, relied on different metabolic strategies to break down the products from above. Beneath that, anaerobic cells persisted in pockets where oxygen could not reach. These mats weren't just biological communities, they were engines of global change. They filtered water, captured sediment, and helped regulate nutrient cycles. They created chemical gradients that shaped the evolution of surrounding organisms. And though they seemed simple, they were incredibly dynamic ecosystems. Meanwhile, the gradual rise of oxygen began influencing the deeper layers of the ocean. As oxygen penetrated further, microbes that had thrived in low-oxygen environments faced extinction or forced relocation. Many retreated to oxygen-poor zones, forming tightly knit communities that clung to the old chemistry of Earth. These environments became refuges for ancient lineages, life forms that resembled the earliest ancestors of all living things. As the world changed, these isolated pockets preserved older metabolic strategies that would otherwise have disappeared. In the shadows of oxygen-rich waters above, deep ocean basins and sediment layers became time capsules, sheltering ancient forms of life that differed enormously from their oxygen-tolerant cousins. These organisms did not adapt to the new world, they resisted it, and in their resistance, they preserved a snapshot of the early Earth's biology. At the same time, life in oxygenated waters began exploring new biochemical pathways. Oxygen allowed for more efficient ways of extracting energy from organic molecules. This surplus of energy gave cells the ability to experiment with more complex internal structures. Some developed protein frameworks that helped maintain their shape. Others evolved mechanisms to transport molecules more efficiently within the cell. These innovations weren't sudden or coordinated. They were scattered across different lineages, arising independently through trial and error. But together, they formed the foundation for what would one day become the eukaryotic cell, a cellular blueprint that would eventually explode into a diversity of plants, animals, fungi, and complex algae. Energy availability was the key. With oxygen, the potential for complexity expanded dramatically. Metabolic reactions could run faster. Molecular repair became more efficient. Cells could afford to develop and maintain structures that would have been too costly in the anaerobic world. In some lineages, DNA became more organized. Instead of floating freely, genetic material began attaching to internal scaffolding or forming loops and structures that made it easier to copy and maintain. This shift paved the way for even greater genetic complexity, allowing future organisms to carry larger genomes and encode more proteins. Other lineages developed transport systems to move molecules around inside the cell. This gave rise to the earliest forms of internal organization. Primitive compartments formed by folding membranes or creating enclosed pockets where specific reactions could occur more effectively. Although these structures were simple and fragile at first, they hinted at the compartmentalization that would later define complex cells. Throughout the oceans, countless tiny evolutionary experiments unfolded simultaneously. Each cell, each colony, each mutation represented a new attempt to navigate the changing world. The global rise of oxygen did not favor any single lineage. It opened doors for many, and evolution stepped through them in every form it could. The ocean surface, once risky and exposed, became a thriving habitat. Sunlight reached vibrant microbial communities that drifted like living clouds across the water. These organisms multiplied quickly, died quickly, and recycled endlessly. Their remains sank into deeper waters, fueling ecosystems that depended on this constant rain of organic matter. This process reshaped the seafloor. Sediment layers became richer in organic carbon. Microbes adapted to consume the newly available nutrients. Oxygen penetrated new layers of sediment, altering chemical gradients and forcing anaerobic organisms deeper still. The biosphere became structured not just horizontally, but vertically. Different depths hosted different forms of life, each tuned to its specific conditions. Meanwhile, volcanic activity continued releasing gases that interacted with the atmosphere. The presence of oxygen altered these reactions, creating new compounds and changing the air's composition. Over long periods, this shift influenced climate and temperature. Some regions cooled, others warmed. Ocean currents responded by changing direction, speed, and depth. Every change in climate reshaped ecosystems. Microbial colonies grew or shrank depending on temperature. Storm patterns altered how nutrients were mixed into the upper layers of the ocean. Seasonal cycles, primitive as they were on the early Earth, influenced where life could thrive. Slowly, subtly, the Earth was moving toward a future in which the first complex cells would emerge. The oxygenation of the atmosphere was not complete, but it was far enough underway that evolution had begun exploring new biochemical territory. The story of life during this time was not dramatic, but it was monumental. Nothing happened quickly, yet everything changed, and deep within the countless forms of microscopic life, one lineage was nearing a breakthrough that would alter the history of biology forever. The path toward the first truly complex organisms was forming, and soon, the world would meet the ancestors of every plant, every animal, and every visible life form that would ever walk, swim, or breathe on Earth. The ocean was no longer a quiet experiment. It had become a library, a place where molecules didn't just drift and collide, they remembered. For millions of years, simple polymers had formed and broken apart, copying themselves with clumsy inconsistency. A segment might duplicate well, or it might fall apart halfway through. But the ocean had time, an inconceivable amount of time, and with time came something subtle, almost invisible: patterns. At first, these patterns were nothing more than chemical coincidences, strings of atoms that accidentally copied themselves slightly better than their neighbors. A bit more stable here, a little faster there, a twist in the structure that resisted hydrolysis for just a few extra seconds. But survival in the prebiotic world wasn't about instinct or behavior or intention, it was about persistence. The molecules that remained intact the longest had more opportunities to be copied, and the ones that copied the most began to dominate. In the warm pools, near the mineral sediments, Along the edges of the world's first tide-filled basins, something revolutionary emerged. A polymer chain that could copy itself, not perfectly, not intelligently, but reliably enough to matter. Its backbone held together just a bit more strongly in heat, its building blocks aligned a bit more predictably, and when it matched with a complementary chain, the fit was just tight enough to guide assembly. For the first time in Earth's history, information had a physical home. Not information like thoughts or memories, but information like instructions, stored in a sequence, not purposefully written, simply there, the way ripples record the wind or a footprint records a passing animal. This molecule, whatever early ancestor it resembled, didn't know that it carried meaning. But chemistry did. Chemistry followed rules, rigid and unforgiving, and the rules favored patterns that could survive the chaos. Lightning storms still cracked across the sky, meteorites still plunged into the sea, volcanoes still belched minerals, heat, and chaos into the water. But now, something existed that could endure that chaos. Chains formed, copies formed, variations appeared. Most were worse, a few, just a few, were better. With every cycle, the ocean became less random, more directed, more structured. The tides lifted the molecules onto warm rock surfaces where they dried and concentrated. Rain washed them back into the sea. Hydrothermal vents cooked them, reshaping the weak and preserving the strong. Cold, dark depths slowed their breakdown, allowing them to persist through quiet ages. An entire planet was the laboratory, and time was the patient observer. And somewhere in that endless churning of chance and chemistry, a line was crossed, a line we still struggle to define, when a molecule wasn't just a molecule anymore, but a message, a pattern that remained through generations, inheritance before heredity, memory before minds. Chemistry had taken its first step toward evolution, and evolution would not stop. Because once information can survive, variation becomes meaningful. Once variation exists, selection has teeth, and once selection begins, the universe starts writing a story. One that will stretch from the first oceans, to the first cells, to the first creatures, to us. This was the dawn of biological memory, the moment when the ocean began to think, not consciously, not aware, but systematically. A planet that had once been nothing more than rock, water, and fire, now held something new, a molecule capable of leaving descendants. Life had not yet begun, not truly, but the ingredients were assembling. And once the recipe is in motion, the outcome is inevitable.